Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your comfiest blanket, and just let your jaw unclench. Tonight, we're taking a little trip into dental history, which, I'll admit, sounds about as thrilling as watching someone scrub barnacles off a ship. But bear with me, because 500 years ago, brushing your teeth was less about minty freshness and more about, well, whatever someone could scrape together that wouldn't immediately kill you. Now, the obvious thing to note is that for most of human history, toothpaste, as we know it, just didn't exist. There were no neat little tubes promising 24-hour protection or whiter teeth in 2 weeks. No, if you wanted clean teeth, you made do with powders, pastes, or sometimes straight-up kitchen ingredients. In fact, for most people, oral hygiene was something you improvised. Think less Colgate, more whatever you can grind in a mortar and pestle. So, let's start with Europe in the 1500s. The Renaissance was in full swing. People were busy painting ceilings and inventing new ways to wage war. But dental care? Still very medieval. A common tooth powder was made from things like crushed eggshells, powdered pumice, or even ground-up oyster shells. Yes, oyster shells. Because apparently nothing says fresh breath like rubbing bits of seafood skeleton on your gums. And, of course, salt was a popular option. Salt was everywhere, cheap enough, and if you ignored the whole bleeding gums thing, it did technically scrub stuff off. People would dip a damp rag into some coarse salt and just go to town on their teeth. The results? Effective, sure. Comfortable? Not even remotely. Imagine chewing on sandpaper every morning and you're pretty close. But wealthy folks naturally like to be a bit fancier about it. Nobles and royals weren't exactly thrilled with the idea of smelling like last night's fish stew. So they added luxury ingredients to their dental arsenal. Things like powdered cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and even crushed pearls. Yes, pearls. Because if you were rich enough to buy gemstones just to grind them into your toothpaste, why not? Of course, did it actually clean teeth? Not really. But it did make your breath smell vaguely like a medieval spice market, which was probably good enough if you were trying to impress someone across the banquet table. Now, speaking of pearls and status symbols, there's something slightly ironic about this. Wealthy people who could afford sugar also tended to have the worst teeth. By the 1500s, sugar was becoming a big deal in Europe. Sweet pastries, candied fruits, even sugar sculptures at banquets. It was the trendy food of the elite, and predictably, it rotted their teeth. Which meant the same people sprinkling cinnamon on their fancy tooth powder were also giving themselves cavities at record speed. You could say that sugar was the medieval dentist's best marketing strategy, if dentists had actually been a thing. Let's drift over to Asia for a moment, because things looked a little different there. In India and the Middle East, people often used a twig called a miswak, or chewing stick. You just chewed one end until it frayed like a brush, then rubbed it across your teeth. It worked surprisingly well, natural antibacterial properties and all. Honestly, it was probably more effective than rubbing oyster shells across your molars, but Europeans weren't exactly quick to pick up on it. Because, why adopt something practical when you can stick to tradition? The Japanese around this time were also using tooth powders, often made from things like powdered charcoal and salt. Yes, charcoal, which, fun fact, is still a trendy natural toothpaste option today. Except back then, it wasn't an Instagram ad. It was just Tuesday. And while it did whiten teeth to an extent, it also wore away enamel, so you might look great at 25 and then be gumming your food by 40. But hey, at least you'd look photogenic in woodblock prints while it lasted. And then there's the odd stuff. Recipes from early modern Europe sometimes recommended things like burnt breadcrumbs mixed with honey, which is basically brushing with toast. Other times, people suggested urine. Yes, urine. It pops up disturbingly often in old hygiene recipes, supposedly for its whitening properties. Ancient Romans swore by it, and while the habit wasn't as mainstream by the 1500s, the idea didn't fully go away. The thought was that ammonia in urine helped clean teeth. The reality was, well, exactly what you're imagining. So, by the time you're picturing a 16th century noble carefully scrubbing his teeth with a paste of ground pearls and cinnamon, just remember, he probably had blackened stumps under there anyway, thanks to his sugar addiction. And the peasants, happily avoiding sugar, were just rubbing salt on their teeth and carrying on with life. A rare case where being poor probably gave you the better dental outcome. So, now that we've firmly established that brushing your teeth in the 1500s was less minty fresh and more crushed oyster surprise, let's drift further down the timeline, because people didn't stop experimenting. In fact, some of the so-called remedies get weirder the closer you look. Take ashes, for example. Fireplace ash was a staple in many homes, and of course someone eventually thought, hey, why not rub this into my gums? Ashes from burnt wood or herbs were a common ingredient in tooth powders well into the early modern period. And while it did provide a gritty texture for scrubbing, it also gave your mouth the faint taste of yesterday's campfire, which, if you've ever been around a bonfire too long, you know isn't exactly the kind of flavor you want lingering in your molars. Then there was vinegar. People sometimes used cloth soaked in vinegar to clean their teeth because, sure, acid eats away at grime. It also eats away at enamel but details, right? Imagine being a 16th century noble, carefully swishing vinegar around your mouth thinking you're the height of hygiene, while slowly melting your teeth like a Renaissance science experiment. It's almost poetic. Of course, we can't leave out the herbalists. Many tooth powders included dried herbs, roots, or flowers, like sage, rosemary, and mint, which honestly sounds nice, almost spa-like. Except they often mixed it with, you guessed it, more salt or powdered bone, or just to keep things festive, burnt animal hooves. So, basically, aromatherapy meets the butcher shop. And then there's the medical side of things, which, let's be honest, rarely made anything better. Physicians of the day often warned against brushing too hard or too often, convinced it might damage the gums and let bad humors in. The irony being that not brushing at all probably let something far worse in. Still, medical advice back then was a dice roll at best. One doctor might tell you to rinse with rose water for freshness, while another swore by a concoction of rabbit brains and honey. And because Google didn't exist, you had to just pick a recipe and hope for the best. Let's wander over to the Elizabethan court for a moment. Queen Elizabeth I famously loved sugar, and it showed. By the end of her life, her teeth were described as black and rotten. Courtiers, ever eager to imitate her style, began darkening their own teeth with soot to look fashionable. Yes, people literally pretended to have cavities because it was trendy. So if you're ever embarrassed by buying into a dumb fad, like charcoal lattes or neon fidget spinners, just remember, at least you didn't smear soot on your teeth to look more like your monarch. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Native American groups had their own traditions for oral hygiene, often involving chewing sticks, herbal rinses, and even abrasive clays. Many of these practices were far more effective than the European pearl and vinegar routine. But, predictably, Europeans arriving in the New World mostly ignored those methods. Because why adopt something sensible when you could keep right on with your burnt hoof toothpaste? And speaking of clay, that actually pops up a lot in tooth cleaning recipes worldwide. Fine clays and chalk were used for their gentle abrasiveness. And, unlike vinegar, they didn't dissolve your enamel. In some ways, clay tooth powders were closer to modern toothpaste than a lot of the fancier spice and pearl concoctions. Of course, no one quite knew why it worked. It was just one of those trial and error things, where enough people thought, hey, my teeth don't feel disgusting after this. And the habit stuck. Now, you might be wondering about toothbrushes. Because sure, powders and pastes are fine, but how exactly were people applying this stuff? The answer, with rags, sticks, feathers, or just their fingers. Yep, dental hygiene was basically a finger painting project until proper bristle toothbrushes arrived in Europe in the 1600s, imported from China. Before that, it was a lot of rubbing, dabbing, and hoping for the best. So, to recap in the sleepiest way possible. If you were alive 500 years ago, your oral hygiene toolkit might have included oyster shells, salt, ashes, herbs, vinegar, pearls, burnt bread, or even urine. You'd smear or rub it on with whatever tool you had, probably your hand, and then smile politely with a mouth full of slowly dissolving teeth. And the best part? People genuinely thought they were nailing it. And that's kind of the comforting thing about history, no matter how questionable our own health fads might be. Juice cleanses, detox teas, whitening strips, at least we can look back and say, hey, at least we're not brushing our teeth with rabbit brains anymore. So there you go. Next time you squeeze out some minty gel on your plastic toothbrush, maybe take a second to appreciate that we've come a long way. And also maybe floss. Because if there's one lesson history teaches us, it's that neglect catches up eventually.